Okay, thank you. Thank you for the organisers for inviting me to speak today. So, change of tack now. I'm going to give you an epidemiological perspective of these data, and I'll try to get to you to lunch as soon as possible. Just a conflict that I am receiving some payment for this talk. Okay, so let's start. I'll talk about what big data is and how it relates to real-world evidence and real-world data. I'll talk about some advantages and some of the disadvantages of these kind of data. And I'll show you some examples of really neat research which can be conducted with these data sets. And then I'll talk about what I believe the future is with big data. Now, the first thing you need to know is what it actually is. And big data is the exponential growth and the variability of data. And this can be structured data or unstructured data. And we think it's going to be really important to medical care, it's really important to business, and in society in general, as important as the internet has become to each of us. And we hope that more data will lead to a better analysis and better healthcare. So real-world evidence is similar, and the definition of this is still evolving, but real-world evidence is data which comes from medical practice amongst heterogeneous sets of patients in real-life settings, such as insurance claims data, such as Kaiser-Permanente in the States, or clinical data from electronic records, or even data from registries. And these data are a little bit different in that they're collected from non-volunteer populations. So they're not little cohort studies that we look at. They're people giving data during their normal path of medical care. So you need to know big data is upon us. And the first thing you need to know about it is that we have a lot of it. When we talk about big data, or the data people talk about it, we talk about the V's. But in terms of the amount of data that we've accumulating up until the year 2011, the US healthcare system has reached 150 exabytes of data. And at this rate of growth, the big data for the US, and this is just the medical data, will reach the zettabyte, which is 10 to the 21 gigabytes, and soon the yottabyte, which is 10 to the 24 gigabytes. Kaiser-Permanente, which is a Californian health network, has greater than 9 million members, and they are believed to have between 27 and 44 petabytes. So in terms of the V's of big data, the volume is the amount, and this could be medical data, imaging data, transaction data, financial data, and most single data sets are 10 to the 15 petabytes. We accumulate this data very quickly, we stream it, and it comes in at unprecedented speed, and this perhaps will make it very useful for medical care. It can come in various fashions, the ordinary kind of data, numeric data, or it can come from drugs on letters, from your VIP systems, or from texts, or from email and videos, or financial institutions. And managing and merging this kind of data is really challenging, and it's something we're still grappling with. The data comes in various peaks and flows. It can be seasonal, daily, and it could be even event-driven like the flu. And of course, it comes from multiple sources, and linking these together has been quite challenging. So why do we care? Well, currently we all care about medical care, and there is evidence suggests that our care is suboptimal. There are gaps in quality of care, and these gaps cannot be explained by different patient mixes or different money given to healthcare. So we have some science in this regard, but we don't use the evidence that well, and then we have people in the system who experience poor care. We don't even capture it that well, and that relates to an overall poor outcomes for patients. So here today we're talking about medical data, and that's what I do work on, large-scale medical data. And the data can come from single or multiple sources. And you have to remember that this data is collected not primarily for research, it's collected for other jobs first. So this means that when you want to do your analysis, it can be quite cheap for you because you don't have to pay for data collection anymore. But against this is the fact that it's collected sometimes without protocols and systems in place. And even if there are protocols and systems, they will change over time, and you won't know that until you see artifact in your data analysis. But a really good thing about these data systems is now they're the whole of population approach to data analysis. They're not 10,000 people that you've recruited across Australia like my other data is. It's the whole of the disease population. And so for the diabetes data set, which I work on, which is a National Diabetes Service Scheme, we think this is almost everyone with diabetes in Australia. So it's an unbiased sample. We get almost everyone. And it could be everyone in your clinic or in the hospital service or in the state morbidity database. And here's just an example of the kind of data where that can come from: administrative, clinical data, electronic health records, and then we'll use these new fancy methods of data mining, machine learning, Bayesian analysis, and even new things that they haven't even quite got to market yet. And we hope that that can be applied across all these different ways to ultimately improve cardiovascular care as well as diabetes care and other chronic disease care. Okay, so the benefits are the size of these data sets. It's more and more power, and that's certainly what we need to answer questions that we cannot answer otherwise. And I've been very successful in this with my PhD student and Jonathan Shaw. So we were able to do some linkage with the diabetes data set to the cancer registry, and I'll show you some data in a minute on that. But we were able to link to some and find some findings with some rare cancers that we just could not do with the smaller observational cohort studies. We can also examine trends in disease with these big data sets. And with our work on the NDSS, we've been able to establish really precise mortality rates in diabetes for all-cause mortality, cancer mortality, and cardiovascular disease mortality. Of course, there is so much data that there's almost too much, and we're accumulating at a rapid speed, and this leads to multi-hypothesis testing, risk of people phishing, and false positives. And we can also misinterpret the data. So I don't collect the diabetes data. I have no idea how it really gets filled out in that form. And then it goes to the consultants at Diabetes Australia who set up the database, but then I analyse it. So I'm not part of data collection like I would be normally in my cohort studies, and this can be problematic. And the other thing that's really problematic for me and a real bugbear for me is the privacy issues that Gerard's talked about, privacy and consent. Obviously, to be on the NDSS, you didn't necessarily consent to your data to be used in the way I'm using it, but it's for the public good, and it's impossible to ask consent from 1.2 million people. The other issues are the lack of covariates. These data are very long in terms of numbers. I've got 1.2 million people, but they're not very wide, so very few covariates. This leads to your estimates being confounded potentially. It's a problem. You have to think about the trade-off. And for example, with the diabetes data set I work on, there's no smoking, there's no BMI. I can cop the lack of smoking because people with diabetes don't necessarily smoke very much, but I would really like to have BMI, for example, or waist or something like that. The data can be really poor in quality, really lots of missing data and really implausible. I've got people who have been diagnosed with diabetes before they were born on the data set. I've got so many people with diabetes who are over 100 you wouldn't believe, and that doesn't seem likely to me. And also, because of the size of the data set, there's a risk of doing the apple and orange thing where you just put two variables together, exposure and outcome, and then you'll see a correlation and you'll try to infer causation, so you must take care. And of course, the data can be dirty, so you must clean it before you move forward. So here's some example data. This is data from my colleague, Ed Gregg from the States. And with this data, he's combined the National Health Survey in the States with the death index, with the US renal data system, and some hospital data. And he's tracked complications of diabetes over time. And he was kind of the only person in the world can do this really, because they were able to link all these big data sets. And as you can see, there's a nice decrease for some of the key for most of the complications. So this is now not my area, so forgive me if I get it wrong. This is a really hot paper that came out in Science this year, and it's a group using, they did some genotyping and RNA sequencing of 600 people with coronary artery disease. And they used the power of genomic data to develop clearer pictures of the biocircuitry in the liver, the heart, the abdominal fat system, subcutaneous fat, and the internal mammary gland artery. And they did some computational modelling, and they showed that these genetic circuitries can be organised in super networks that work together to influence how tissues carry out normal life processes such as glucose metabolism, lipid metabolism. And when they're interrupted by putting on weight, ageing, infection, they can result in, they can be affected and result in chronic systemic disorders, including cardiometabolic disease, such as diabetes and heart disease. This is some other data. This is from the Emerging Risk Factors Collaboration. It's one of the collaborations that we at Bacon contribute to. So this group put together 91 cohorts from the years 1960 to 2007, and they've got about 700,000 people and about 130,000 deaths. And they've done lots of things with this cohort, but I thought this was really interesting because they did some life table modelling, and they looked at some life expectancy data, and they showed that if you have history of 2 or more of the following of diabetes, stroke or MI at the age of 60, this can knock about 12 years off your life. And if you have 3, it knocks about 15 years off your life. And if you do this work, life expectancy work, you understand that these numbers are huge. So across the population, to lose 12 and 15 years is a really, really significant loss. These are some other data coming from the UK, from Shah, and this was published last year. And it looks at heart failure in diabetes, and looks at heart failure before the heart attack, if you know what I mean. So they use the Calibre program, and this is a linkage system which links people in primary care in the UK to death and other disease registries. And they included 30-year-olds between 1998 and 2010, and they looked at their first manifestation of CVD, and they looked at 12 different manifestations and ordered them in which appeared first. And they had about 1.2 million people, of which 35,000 had diabetes, and they had about 120,000 CVD events over 5 years, and 6,000 of them were in those with diabetes. And their key finding was that heart failure was the initial presentation or manifestation of CVD, second to before MI and second to PVD and PAD. And you have to, I'm sure you all understand the caveat that heart failure is notoriously difficult to capture in these studies and on hospital coding systems. So here's their key findings. So peripheral artery disease was the first presentation, and about 16 people, percent of those with diabetes who had a cardiovascular event, and heart failure was the first presentation in just less than that, in 14%. And the corresponding numbers for no diabetes were 9% and 12%. So this was really interesting for those people who do heart failure research, because we all often think that someone with diabetes has a heart attack first, has a lot of damage, and ends up 5 years later with heart failure. So it was pretty exciting for those people, but the criticisms would be that there's some MI here, but then there's this coronary disease not specified here, and unheralded coronary death. So, I would put those together. But an interesting piece of work from pooled data and linkage sources nonetheless. And when they looked at their hazard ratios, you can see that heart failure, there was a 56% increased risk, and even higher for PAD. And there was actually some protection for subarachnoid hemorrhage and AAA, and they don't talk much about this in the discussion, but they say that perhaps people with diabetes have diabetes-mediated extracellular changes that improve the matrix of the vessels, but they don't really elaborate. Okay, so this is now some of my work. So I have access to this data set through an NHMRC grant, which some people in the audience are part of. And I linked it to the death index and the cancer index, and I had to almost sell my child to do so. But we got there in the end. And this data set, the diabetes data set, is about 85 to 90% complete with diabetes. It's really, really good for the type 1s, almost 90%, and a little bit lower in the 80s for people who are self-controlled with their diabetes. We have adequate quality from the year 2000, even though the data set started in 1987. And I've got limited demographic variables, but a lot of people. And so that was this is my first linkage, and I've just done another linkage, but the data hasn't come yet. It's taken 2 years. So the first linkage was to the NDI and the cancer registry. The second linkage is to the PBS medication history and the ANS dataset, which is a dataset of dialysis and transplant. And then next year, maybe I'll link to this kind of group. So I've got this data over about 12 years. So here's some results from the first linkage I did via an NHMRC grant. So these are now just people who died on the data set for type 2, and this is just men, but women's look the same. And as you can see, if you look at all the deaths occurring over time, the proportion of people dying from cardiovascular disease starts quite high, but over time it comes down, and it comes down in diabetes also. Only then, but the cancer deaths come up. So we seem to manage our people through their cardiovascular disease. It would appear, and perhaps only so they can die of cancer later on, and the other deaths were pretty stable. We were the first to show this, but now it's been repeated in the States since. With this same data link, I was able to look at whether type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes increases your risk of cancer. And there was some type 2 work already done, but there was no type 1 work done. And we showed that having type 1 or type 2 increases your risk of cancer, all the main cancers and even some of the rarer cancers. And that was quite a unique finding. And because we had so many people and a good amount of time, we could actually look at how much of the increased risk and the hazard ratios or the relative risks were due to reverse causation or detection bias. So that was a really neat piece of work from my student. And with this data set, we have all the type 1 people, and we have all their deaths as well. And people with type 1, we know, die from heart disease, and that's in the orange. But we were surprised to find that the proportion of people dying from endocrine and metabolic diseases is still quite significant right through the ages. And this is a really a neat finding that which we could only have done by linking the big diabetes registry to the NDI. Okay, so here's an example of where you can get it wrong. So this is work came out from Google. So Google tried to look at, had algorithms that would capture people searching the flu on the internet, and they'd capture that. And with that, they tried to predict the number of visits in the States due to flu, except they got it wrong. They were completely out. They doubled the number that CDC had. And people would say that this is because of big data hubris, which says that big data is not a substitute, but it's a complement to ordinary analysis. Okay, so who facilitates this kind of work for us? Well, we need the community to be on board, and I think we're there with the community. They will allow their data to be used with minimal or no consent, but the government is still lagging in this regard. We need a uniform health system, and we need the government to recognise that we must measure health very carefully and ongoing over time. We need to invest in really good data platforms to do the analysis, and we need a commitment to improve data. And ultimately, we'd like to have a system as the Scandinavians have, where they have universal identifiers. But the barriers, we have no good common terminology, we have incomplete data sets, and we have lack of data quality assurance programs. We have no really good protocols for data analysis, and linkage protocols need more development also. We need the government to take a lead and to make some rules around collaboration and sort of give some incentive for people to data share. And of course, we need to address privacy. It's becoming, it actually impedes our progress compared to the other parts of the world. Okay, the future. I think big data is here and will continue to be a big part of our future as health professionals. There are great gains in efficiency and statistical power, but we must be aware of the issues and the issues which may compromise the interpretation of the findings. I think the biggest challenge I see is that the enthusiasm level is there, but I just don't think we're quite ready. The field is still too young, and we need standards to continue to be developed, and we need a Rosetta Stone to bring the standards together and state what are the important things about analysis and linkage and what are the best approaches. And I'll leave that there.